The first official record of humanity in the Kethri Galactic Archive described them as physically fragile, emotionally volatile, and strategically insignificant, a species that had only recently stumbled into faster-than-light travel and immediately requested observer status. And the archivist who compiled that report, a soft-shelled Kethri named Velen, remembered feeling bored as he watched the human envoys speak with careful politeness about peace, cooperation, and shared prosperity. Because the galaxy had seen this pattern before countless times, a young species emerging blinking into the light, eager to please, terrified of conflict, desperate to be protected by older powers. And the Kethri Council had already decided that Earth would be placed under provisional oversight by the Triarch Compact, a coalition that specialized in absorbing weak civilizations for their own good. A phrase that sounded benevolent in every known language but always ended the same way, with resources redirected, fleets stationed, and sovereignty quietly erased. And when the human ambassador, a gray-haired woman named Elena Ramirez, asked what oversight meant in practical terms, the councils avoided specifics, because specifics tended to upset young species. And when she pressed again calmly, her voice steady, the chair being assured her that humans would be safe, that the Compact would defend Earth from external threats, that all humanity needed to do was refrain from militarizing beyond local defense, share their technological research, and accept a permanent monitoring presence in their system. And Velen noted with mild surprise that Ramirez did not argue, did not protest, did not plead. She simply nodded, thanked the Council for their concern, and said that humanity would take the proposal under advisement, which was interpreted as compliance, because the Compact had never been refused by anyone who mattered. And within 3 standard cycles Compact survey fleets arrived in Sol, their massive angular ships blotting out stars as they established orbital control points. And humanity did exactly what the Council expected. They stood down their visible military forces, decommissioned several shipyards, and broadcast messages of cooperation. And for a while the galaxy forgot about them entirely, because attention always drifted toward louder, prouder species, until the Yaltek incursion began on the edge of compact space, a brutal expansionist swarm that specialized in harvesting populations and strip mining systems. And when the Yaltek overran 3 protectorates in quick succession, the Compact realized it had overextended. Its fleet spread thin, maintaining order over dozens of subdued worlds. And so, when Earth sent a message offering assistance, the Council laughed openly. Recordings later showed several delegates displaying color patterns associated with amusement, because what could the soft, barely spacefaring humans possibly contribute against a force that had annihilated civilizations older than their written history? And the reply sent back to Earth was polite but dismissive, thanking humanity for their concern and advising them to remain sheltered under Compact protection. And Elena Ramirez received that message in a quiet room beneath the Andes, surrounded by men and women who would not laugh at all, because they had been waiting for this exact moment. And Ramirez said simply that the offer would stand, and then she authorized a recall signal, a signal that had not been used in 2 centuries, a signal embedded in outdated probe telemetry, in civilian shipping codes, in background noise no alien monitoring system had ever bothered to fully decode, because it looked like junk data from a primitive species. And across the galaxy, in places no one associated with humanity anymore, dormant human assets began to wake up, in shipyards disguised as mining platforms beyond charted space, in deep void. Habitats crewed by descendants of volunteers who had left Earth generations ago under secrecy laws that predated first contact, and even within compact space itself, where human commercial vessels had quietly mapped hyperspace currents with precision no one noticed, because humans had been careful to appear clumsy. And on Earth, children went to school, traffic moved through cities, and the sky looked calm. But beneath the surface, factories that had been mothballed were coming back online. Crews assembling with a professionalism born from drills that had never stopped. Not really, because humanity had learned long before joining the galaxy that survival favored those who prepared in silence. And when the Yaltek finally reached the Sol perimeter, tearing through the lightly armed compact picket ships stationed there, the Council panicked, demanding to know why their forces were insufficient, accusing each other of negligence. And only then did they remember Earth, not as a protected world, but as a liability, and they ordered an evacuation of key compact personnel from the system, fully intending to abandon humanity to buy time. and the message informing Earth of the strategic withdrawal was sent without apology, because in the compact worldview, weak species were expendable by definition. And when Ramirez heard it, she closed her eyes for a moment, not in fear, but in something like disappointment, and she replied that evacuation would not be necessary, that humanity had the situation under control, a statement that triggered another round of laughter in council chambers light years away, laughter that cut off abruptly when long-range sensors detected hyperspace ruptures forming around Sol, not the crude, unstable signatures of early jump drives, but clean, controlled openings that suggested a mastery of physics the compact had never attributed to humans, and one by one, ships emerged, sleek, dark-hulled vessels with minimal external structures, their profiles unfamiliar and unsettling, because they did not match any known human designs cataloged by the compact, and there were hundreds of them, then thousands, forming precise formations without broadcast chatter, without wasted motion, and the Yaltek swarm hesitated, something it had never done before, because predators recognize other predators instinctively, and when the first human ship transmitted, it did not issue threats or demands. It sent a single message on all frequencies, in clear, simple language, stating that this system was under human protection, and that all hostile forces had 10 minutes to withdraw, and the Yaltek responded with weapon fire, because that was their nature, and the battle that followed would later be studied in stunned silence by every military academy in the galaxy, because the human fleet did not fight like anyone else. They did not charge or retreat. They flowed, anticipating Yaltek movements seconds before they occurred, disabling command, nodes, collapsing swarm cohesion, using weapons that targeted not hulls but internal biological processes, turning the Yaltek advantage in numbers into a liability as ships drifted powerless into each other, and from a distant observation post, a Kethri analyst named Velen watched the data streams pile up, unable to reconcile it with the report he had written years earlier, the one that said humans were weak, and for the first time in his long career, he felt something uncomfortably close to fear, because as the Yaltek fleet broke and fled, pursued just far enough to ensure they would not return, the human ships did not celebrate, did not broadcast victory. They simply reformed their lines and turned outward, placing themselves between Sol and the wider galaxy. And in that moment, as the rescue fleet held position, the truth finally settled over the council. Chambers like a cold shadow. Humanity had never been asking for protection. They had been buying time, and now the galaxy was about to learn what that time had been used for. The official compact communique that followed the battle over Sol was filled with careful phrasing and passive instructions, praising human bravery, acknowledging unexpected contributions, and reaffirming the value of mutual defense. But behind closed doors, panic ruled, because the data from that engagement refused to behave like propaganda. Every sensor log, every destroyed Yaltek hull, every time-stamped maneuver painted the same brutal picture. Humanity had not barely survived, they had dominated. And the counselors who had laughed were now arguing over how such a miscalculation had occurred, some blaming intelligence failures, others accusing the compact Navy of incompetence, while a few quieter voices began to ask questions no one wanted to answer out loud. What else had the humans hidden? And on Earth the mood was not triumphant either, because celebration was a luxury reserved for after survival was assured, and Elena Ramirez stood in the same subterranean chamber, listening as Admiral Marcus Hale outlined the next phase, explaining that the rescue fleet had been only a fraction of available assets, carefully calibrated to send a message without triggering immediate escalation, because humanity did not want a war with the entire galaxy, not yet. And Ramirez nodded, understanding the weight of that sentence, because humanity's strength was real, but so were the numbers arrayed against them, and the goal had never been conquest. It had been deterrence, protection, and buying space for allies who had none. And those allies were already calling for help, because the Yaltek retreat had been messy, splinter groups breaking off and venting their rage on the nearest undefended systems, most of them compact detectorates whose fleets had been pulled back toward core worlds, and suddenly the moral fiction protection collapsed. Worlds that had trusted the compact were burning, and it was human ships that arrived first in system after system, sometimes minutes before total collapse, sometimes seconds after orbital defenses failed, and the pattern repeated with unsettling consistency. Humans did not demand allegiance, did not plant flags. They evacuated civilians, stabilized orbits, repaired infrastructure, and left behind automated defense platforms keyed to local control, a style of intervention so alien to the compact playbook that some counselors argued it must be a long con, a softer form of empire. But those accusations rang hollow when the protected worlds began broadcasting their own accounts, voices shaking with relief as they described human crews working themselves to exhaustion, sharing food, medical supplies, and something far more valuable, respect. And on one such world, a water-rich moon called Telesar, Velen watched a live feed a human engineer named Aisha Khan laughing gently as she taught Telesar technicians how to maintain a shield generator, patiently repeating herself, encouraging questions, never talking down, and Velen felt a growing unease. Because this behavior did not fit the models either, conquerors did not act like this, manipulators did not empower others so freely, and when Telesar's governing council formally requested a defense pact with Earth rather than the compact, it sent shockwaves through galactic politics. Because it was the first time Protectorate had chosen a younger species over an established power, and others followed, cautiously at first, then with increasing boldness, until the compact found itself bleeding legitimacy faster than ships. And in response, hardliners pushed for a show of force, arguing that humanity had violated oversight agreements by maintaining hidden fleets, that they were a destabilizing element, and that decisive action now would prevent a far greater threat later. And the vote was close, painfully so, but fear has a way of tipping scales, and orders were drafted for a containment operation around Sol, a blockade designed to isolate Earth and force concessions. And when those orders reached the staging fleets, confusion spread among the captains, because many of them had seen human ships in action, had fought alongside them during the Yaltek counteroffensives, had watched human crews die to protect alien civilians they had never met, and the idea of turning weapons on them felt wrong in a way no regulation could easily justify. Delays crept in, requests for clarification multiplied, and humanity noticed, because they had been listening the whole time, not through espionage or hacks, but through something simpler, relationships. Human diplomats embedded with relief efforts heard the rumors. Captains they had shared meals would send quiet warnings. And when Ramirez addressed the council again, this time her voice carried a steel edge that had been absent before. She stated plainly that any attempt to blockade Earth would be interpreted as a hostile act, not just against humanity, but against every world currently under human protection. And she listed them one by one, dozens of names scrolling across the chamber displays, each representing lives saved while the compact hesitated. And she did not threaten retaliation. She did not boast about hidden weapons. She simply said that humanity would not step aside, because they remembered what it was like to be weak and alone, and they would not allow that fate to be imposed on others by convenience or fear. And the silence that followed was heavier than any applause, because in that moment the galaxy began to understand that the rescue fleet had not arrived to save humanity at all. It had arrived to announce that humans were done asking for permission, and whether the galaxy liked it or not, things were about to change. The compact attempt to regain control did not begin with open war, but with pressure. Sanctions disguised as regulatory adjustments. Trade routes quietly rerouted, access to hyperspace relays restricted under the justification of safety reviews. And for many species, this kind of squeeze was enough to force submission, because economies collapsed long before fleets ever moved. But humanity had prepared for this too, not through stockpiles alone, but through redundancy. Earth had never tied its survival to any single galactic system. And when the restrictions hit, human logistics networks simply shifted. Routes that had never been registered with compact authorities came online, slower but resilient, crewed by civilian captains who had trained for exactly the scenario. And more importantly, the worlds under human protection did not comply with the sanctions either. Telesar was the first to openly defy the compact by continuing trade with Earth, followed by 3 more systems that publicly cited human assistance during the Yaltek crisis as justification. And suddenly the compact was no longer disciplining a single upstart species. It was confronting a growing coalition held together not by conquest or tribute, but by shared experience. And that scared them more than human firepower ever could, because it challenged the very narrative that had kept the compact dominant for centuries, that order required hierarchy, that safety required control, and that young species could not be trusted with real power. And as tensions escalated, skirmishes began on the fringes, not full battles but probes and tests, compact patrols challenging human escorts, transponder disputes turning into weapon locks, each side measuring the other's restraint, and humanity's restraint was deliberate, frustratingly so, because they disengaged whenever possible, recorded everything, and broadcast the unedited footage to every neutral world, showing compact ships firing first, escalating first, and retreating when humans responded with calm, overwhelming precision, and public opinion across the galaxy began to shift, slowly at first, then all at once as commentators, traders, and even former compact officers began to question who the real destabilizing force was. And inside the compact military, morale cracked, crews whisper about defecting, about refusing orders, about the strange professionalism of human commanders who treated even enemy survivors with dignity. And in one notable incident, a compact frigate disabled during a border clash was boarded by a human rescue team that prioritized medical aid over intelligence seizure, returning the ship and its crew intact with only a warning to stay clear of protected zones, a move that baffled strategists but resonated deeply with rank-and-file sailors who realized they were not viewed as expendable by the humans. And while the galaxy argued and hesitated, the Yaltek adapted, licking their wounds and learning from their defeat, their splinter groups coalescing under a new war brood that studied human tactics with obsessive focus, avoiding direct engagements, striking logistics, targeting refugee convoys, deliberately attacking worlds under human protection to provoke a response they could analyze. And when reports of these atrocities reached Earth, the debate humanity had been postponing could no longer be avoided because restraint had limits, and protection without decisive deterrence invited predators. And in a secure chamber far from any council oversight, Ramirez listened as scientists, admirals, and civilian leaders argued openly, some warning that a full demonstration of human power would unify the galaxy against them, others countering that continued half measures would only bleed them dry while emboldening enemies. And when the room finally quieted, it was not a general or a politician who spoke, but a linguist named Daniel Cho, who had spent years studying first contact failures, and he pointed out that every major galactic power shared one trait. They believed dominance was the only language that mattered, and so long as humanity refused to speak it fluently, they would always be misunderstood, and the decision that followed was not unanimous, but it was resolute. Humanity would end the ambiguity, not through annihilation, but through revelation, and the target would not be the compact or even the Yaltek directly, but a dead system on the edge of known space, a former Yaltek, hive world stripped to bedrock centuries ago, chosen precisely because no civilians remained. And when the announcement was made, humanity invited observers from every major species, offering full sensor access, no secrecy, no spin, and many assumed it was a bluff, a desperate attempt to project confidence, until the observers arrived and watched as a single human task group took position around the lifeless planet. And for several long minutes, nothing happened. And then space itself seemed to fold, not tear or rupture, but compress, as human technology manipulated gravity on a planetary scale, increasing mass without adding matter, stressing the planet's core beyond any natural limit. And in less than a minute, the world cracked, mantle and crust collapsing inward in a controlled implosion that released less radiation than a standard bombardment, leaving behind a dense, inert remnant where a planet had been. And the human commander calmly explained that the process was reversible at lower thresholds, useful for terraforming or stabilizing failing stars, and that what they had just shown was not a weapon but a tool, one they had refrained from using offensively because they understood the terror it inspired. And across the galaxy, watching in stunned silence, leaders finally grasped the depth of their mistake. Because humanity had not been hiding a bigger gun. They had been living with the responsibility of power no one else had ever chosen to restrain. And as the feeds cut, and the observers returned home carrying memories they would never fully process, the balance of the galaxy shifted, not with an explosion, but with a realization. The rescue fleet had been the warning, and this was the proof. The aftermath of the demonstration rippled outward faster than any shockwave, because fear travels quickly when certainty dies. And within days, delegations that had avoided Earth for decades requested talks, not to the compact, but directly, bypassing old hierarchies in a quiet admission that the old order no longer spoke for everyone. And Ramirez accepted every request with the same measured tone, insisting on open forums, shared records, and mutual guarantees, conditions that unsettled, traditional powers because they removed the leverage of secrecy. And while diplomats talked, humanity acted, expanding relief corridors, reinforcing protected systems, and most importantly, sharing just enough technology to ensure that no world under their shield would ever again be helpless. And this redistribution of capability alarmed the compact more than the planetary demonstration ever had, because a galaxy of dependent protectorates was manageable, but a galaxy of partners was not. And so, the hardliners made their final gamble, authorizing Operation Iron Veil, a coordinated strike intended to cripple human command and control through simultaneous attacks on relay nodes, civilian shipyards, and allied worlds, betting that speed and shock would force humanity to overreact and justify a unified retaliation. And the order went out, but fractured on execution, because not every captain complied, some delaying just long enough to leak warnings, others outright refusing and jumping away. And humanity again used that hesitation not to strike first, but to prepare, evacuations accelerating, fleets dispersing into layer formations designed not for conquest but interception. And when Iron Veil finally fell, it did not land on empty systems. It collided with readiness. Compact strike groups found themselves met by human vessels already in motion, already positioned to protect population centers rather than assets. And the battles that followed were chaotic and brief, because human doctrine emphasized decapitation without annihilation, disabling engines, blinding sensors, isolating command ships, and offering surrender before delivering final blows. And many compact crews took that offer, because the alternative was watching their ships methodically dismantled while human pilots calmly talked them through escape procedures. And as images of these engagements spread, the narrative of the compact had relied on collapse completely, because aggressors do not pause to save their enemies. And in the midst of this unraveling, the Yaltek struck again, launching a massive assault on a cluster of allied worlds near the galactic rim, calculating that humanity would be too entangled politically to respond in force. And this time humanity did not issue warnings, because the pattern was clear and the cost of mercy had been measured in lives. And the rescue fleet that arrived dwarfed the one that had first appeared over Sol, emerging from multiple vectors with coordination that suggested centuries of refinement. And the Yaltek war brood attempted to adapt, deploying countermeasures, sacrificial screens, and biological jammers tuned to previous human responses. But humanity had anticipated that too, because adaptation was their oldest enemy, and they changed tactics mid-engagement, introducing variables faster than the Yaltek could process, turning the battlefield into a storm of shifting parameters that shredded swarm cohesion completely. And when it was over, there was no retreat, no splintering, because the brood had been neutralized at the strategic level, its command intelligence isolated and contained rather than destroyed, studied to ensure it would never reemerge. And as human ships lingered only long enough to stabilize the region and tend to the wounded of every species, a message was broadcast galaxy-wide, not triumphant, not threatening, stating simply that humanity would protect those who could not protect themselves and would stop those who preyed on them, no matter how long it took. And hearing that, Velen understood at last why his initial assessment had failed so completely, because he had measured humanity by what they displayed, not by what they endured, and endurance had shaped them into something the galaxy had no framework to understand, a species that could wield unimaginable power and still choose restraint until restraint became cruelty. And as compact world began to secede openly, fleets standing down, rather than fight a war no one believed in anymore, the question was no longer whether humanity was weak or strong. It was whether the galaxy could adapt fast enough to coexist with species that had arrived not to rule, but to refuse the old rules entirely. The collapse of the compact did not come with a single dramatic announcement or the fall of a capital world, but with a quiet unraveling that historians would later describe as inevitability made visible. Because once fear lost its monopoly, obedience followed out the door, and systems that had endured compact oversight for generations began asserting autonomy, not violently but administratively, reclaiming fleets, reopening borders, rewriting treaties, and in many cases asking humanity not to govern them but to witness their independence as a form of legitimacy. And humanity accepted that role carefully, refusing exclusive alliances, insisting that new regional councils include multiple species and rotating leadership, a structural humility that baffled observers who expected empire and instead found facilitation. And this restraint did more to cement human influence than any fleet ever could, because power that refuses to dominate becomes a reference point rather than a threat. And while diplomats redrew the political map, the practical work of stabilization continued. Human engineers rebuilding relay networks, medics training local responders, strategists sharing defensive doctrines tailored to each species' psychology and biology. And everywhere the same pattern emerged. Worlds once drained to support distant cores began to thrive when allowed to prioritize their own survival. And the galaxy's economic flows shifted accordingly, away from centralized extraction toward distributed resilience. And this redistribution weakened the remnants of the compact faster than any battle, because their strength had always depended on imbalance. And as that imbalance faded, so did their relevance. And still humanity did not claim victory, because they understood something the older powers have forgotten, that history punishes complacency more reliably than arrogance. And so they prepared for the next unknown, quietly, collaboratively, and with an honesty that unsettled those who preferred comforting myths. And that honesty extended inward as well. Because on Earth there were debates that grew sharper as the crisis eased, questions about how long humanity could sustain this role, about the moral weight of deciding when restraint ended and intervention began, about the risk of becoming what they oppose. And Ramirez addressed those concerns not with slogans but with transparency, opening decision logs, inviting civilian oversight, allowing dissent to shape policy, because she believed that secrecy was the seed of every empire's rot. And the galaxy watched this internal argument with fascination, some with admiration, others with suspicion, because a species willing to argue openly about power while holding it was unprecedented. And in the shadows of that fascination, smaller threats stirred, opportunistic raiders, ideological extremists, remnants of defeated orders testing the edges of the new system. And humanity responded to each not with uniform force but with calibrated solutions, sometimes military, sometimes economic, sometimes cultural, always contextual, always learning. And over time a new norm emerged, not peace as the absence of conflict, but stability as the presence of response. A galaxy where predation was no longer profitable, because someone would always show up, not to conquer, but to stop it. And Velen, now serving as a liaison rather than archivist, found himself rewriting the entry on humanity for the last time, deleting words like fragile and insignificant, replacing them with phrases that felt insufficient but honest, adaptive, protective, dangerously patient. And as he finalized the record, he realized that the most profound shift humanity had brought was not technological or military, but philosophical. They had reminded the galaxy that strength did not have to justify itself with domination, that rescue could be a form of leadership, and that the true measure of power was not how quickly it was used, but how long it was held back, waiting for the moment when using became an act of responsibility rather than ambition. In the years that followed, the galaxy settled into an uneasy rhythm that felt less like peace and more like collective breath-holding, because everyone understood that the old rules were gone, but the new ones were still being written, and humanity stood at the center of that uncertainty not as rulers, but as a constant variable that forced others to rethink their assumptions. And this tension came to a head when a coalition of mid-tier powers, fearful of becoming irrelevant in a system where humans acted as arbiters by presence alone, proposed the formation of a unified defense, a core designed explicitly to counterbalance human influence, publicly framed as a stabilizing measure, but privately discussed as a hedge against what they called the human question. And when news of the accord reached Earth, it did not trigger mobilization or condemnation. It triggered analysis, because humanity had learned the hard way that fear dressed up as policy could spiral faster than any invasion. And Ramirez convened a council not of generals, but of historians, sociologists, and first contact specialists, people who studied why civilizations fractured under stress. And the conclusion they reached was uncomfortable but clear. The galaxy was not afraid of human power anymore. It was afraid of human unpredictability, not because humans were erratic, but because they refused to behave according to familiar imperial patterns. And that uncertainty bred paranoia. And so humanity decided to do something no major power in galactic history had ever attempted. They made themselves legible, opening their strategic doctrines, publishing red lines, clearly stating what actions would trigger intervention and what would not, explaining their thresholds for force in plain language accessible to any species. And this radical transparency shocked the Accord's founders, because it stripped them of the ambiguity they needed to rally support. And worse, it forced them to confront their own motives. in public debate, and several worlds quietly withdrew from the initiative when their populations questioned why a defensive pact was needed against a species that had consistently limited its own responses. And while that political struggle unfolded, a far more dangerous development emerged from the containment facilities holding the Yaltek command intelligence. Because adaptation had not stopped with defeat, and human researchers detected signs of emergent behavior, a restructuring of decision, pathways that suggested the brood was learning to think beyond swarm logic, developing something uncomfortably close to individual strategy, and the debate over what to do was immediate and fierce, some arguing for termination before the intelligence could evolve further, others insisting that understanding it was the only way to prevent future threats. And the choice ultimately fell to a young cognitive scientist named Mateo Alvarez, who proposed direct communication, not to negotiate, but to observe, to see if comprehension itself altered the trajectory. And when contact was established, what spoke back was not a monster or a mastermind, but a fragmented awareness grappling with loss, confused by the concept of restraint, unable to reconcile why humanity had chosen containment over extinction. And in that exchange, humanity confronted a mirror they did not expect, because the Yaltek intelligence asked a question that no one in the room had anticipated, asking why humans protected the weak when dominance would have been simpler. And the answer, spoken quietly by Alvarez, was that humans knew what it was like to be hunted by forces they did not understand, and had survived not by becoming those forces, but by outlasting them. And that response did not end the threat, but changed it, because the intelligence began modeling alternatives to consumption-based expansion, unstable and incomplete but real. And across the galaxy, this development reignited debate about humanity's influence. Because if even their enemies were being altered by exposure to human ethics, then the fear was no longer about fleets or weapons. It was about contagion of ideas. And some leaders whispered that this was the most dangerous form of power of all. And as a unified defense accord stalled and splintered under its own contradictions, a final test loomed, not from an external invasion, but from within human allied space, where frontier world, newly independent and flush with shared technology, began exploiting its neighbors, justifying aggression with the same arguments the compact once used. And when the plea for help reached Earth, it forced humanity to confront the line they had drawn so carefully, because stopping a former victim from becoming a predator meant turning their doctrine inward, and the decision they made next to define not just how the galaxy saw them, but whether their vision of power could survive contact with reality itself. The response to the frontier world's aggression came without spectacle, because by then humanity understood that endings were rarely dramatic. They were instructional, and the human task group that arrived did so openly, broadcasting intent and evidence, presenting intercepted communications, economic data, and first-hand testimony that laid bare the transformation of fear into entitlement. And when the world's leadership protested, invoking sovereignty and survival, the human envoy listening to them did not argue philosophy. She simply asked whether their safety truly required the suffering of others. And when the answer dissolved into rhetoric, the intervention began, not with orbital strikes or regime collapse, but with isolation, targeted sanctions enforced by shared networks, suspension of technological support, and the withdrawal of defensive guarantees. All measures humanity had publicly defined long ago, and the effect was swift, because power built on borrowed strength collapses when the lending stops. And within weeks, internal opposition forced negotiations, concessions were made, reparations agreed to, and oversight accepted not from Earth, but from a council of neighboring systems, a deliberate choice that reinforced the principle humanity had insisted on from the beginning, that accountability should be local whenever possible. And as the crisis resolved, the galaxy watched closely, because this was the moment skeptics had predicted would reveal hypocrisy. And instead they saw consistency, a willingness to protect without enabling, to intervene without ruling, and to step back once balance was restored. And that consistency did more to cement the new order than any fleet maneuver ever had, because it proved that the rescue fleet had never been a temporary phenomenon. It was an expression of a deeper ethic, one forged long before humanity reached the stars, shaped by centuries of internal conflict, where survival depended not on purity or dominance, but on learning when to stop. And over time, the phrase that spread through galactic discourse was not a slogan, but a cautionary summary. Do not mistake human patience for weakness, because patience was a space in which they decided whether you would be saved or stopped, and Velen, now old by Ketheri's standards, recorded the final amendment to the archives, noting that humanity's greatest weapon was not their fleets or their technology, but their refusal to accept inevitability, whether it was the inevitability of conquest, extinction, or becoming what history expected them to be. And as new species emerged into the galactic community, blinking into the same uncertain light humanity once had, it was human ships that greeted them first, not imposing oversight, but offering context, warning them gently about predators, about power, and about the cost of forgetting who you were when you were small. And so the galaxy learned, slowly and unevenly, that the rescue fleet had not arrived. Because aliens thought humans were weak, it arrived because humanity remembered exactly what weakness felt like, and they had decided, collectively and irrevocably, that no one else would have to face the dark alone if humans were still standing. The final reckoning did not arrive as an enemy armada or a political betrayal, but as understanding settling into place across a galaxy that had been forced to grow up faster than it wanted to. Because once humanity proved that power could be bounded by choice, every other civilization had to confront the stories it told itself about necessity. And those stories began to fail. And with their failure came a quieter era defined less by grand wars and more by constant negotiation, mutual deterrence, and shared vigilance, and humanity remained present within that system not as judges but as participants who refused exemption, submitting themselves to the same transparency and accountability they demanded of others. And that decision closed the final door to empire because it made hypocrisy visible and therefore unsustainable. And when Ramirez stepped down years later, replaced through open process rather than crisis, the transition passed without incident, a moment that would have shocked earlier generations who believed stability required singular figures. And Velen, reviewing centuries of archived conflict, realized that the rescue fleet's true legacy was not the battles it fought, but the assumptions it destroyed, the belief that safety must come from domination, that weakness deserved exploitation, that patience was the absence of strength rather than its proof. And as the galaxy continued to expand into unknown regions, encountering new dangers and new minds, the standard response was no longer to ask who could be controlled, but who could be trusted, a subtle shift that changed outcomes before weapons were ever considered. And humanity's role in that future was neither central nor peripheral but connective, a species that linked worlds through memory as much as capability, reminding others through example that survival was not a zero-sum equation. And when the question was finally asked in academic forums and public channels alike, when did the galaxy truly change? The answer was not the destruction of a fleet or the collapse of the compact. It was the moment aliens realized that humans had been underestimated not because they were hiding fear, but because they were hiding responsibility. And once that realization took root, the old age ended and a harder, fairer one began, not perfect, not peaceful, but honest. And in that honesty, humanity found what it had been seeking all along, not dominance among the stars, but a place where rescue no longer required permission and strength no longer needed to prove itself through ruin. And with that, the story closed, not with conquest or applause, but with continuity, a galaxy still dangerous, still flawed, but no longer blind to the cost of mistaking patience for weakness.